It's that time of year, right? Late October. You know exactly what it looks like. Glowing pumpkins on every porch, kids running around in costumes, their bags getting heavier and heavier with candy. It's just a night of fun, harmless, spooky stuff. But have you ever, really stopped to think about it? Why ghosts? Why do we spend this one night every year celebrating the idea that the dead are walking among us?
Well, to get to the bottom of that question, we have to go back in time. And I don't mean to some spooky haunted house from a movie. No, we have to go to a real haunted island. We have to go to Ireland in the 1840s. Because the real origin of Halloween, it isn't a story made up to scare us. It's a true story that should honestly break our hearts.
Okay, so to really understand what happened, we need to see what the world was like before the disaster hit. And the best way to do that is to look at it through the eyes of a typical family. Let's call them the Murphys, living out in County Tipperary around 1844.
Now, when you picture a cabin, I want you to erase any cozy, rustic image you have in your head. A British survey at the time found that about half of Ireland's rural families lived like this. We're talking about a single room, no windows, made of mud. The floor is literally just dirt. There's a peat fire smoldering in the middle of the room, and with no chimney, the smoke just hangs in the air, stinging your eyes, filling your lungs. And you weren't alone in there. The family pig, whose sale was often the only way to pay the rent, lived right there inside with everyone.
So you have to ask, why were they living on such a knife's edge? Well, it wasn't an accident, it was by design. It was a cage, really, built over centuries by something called the British Penal Laws, a whole set of rules designed to systematically crush the Irish Catholic people. But the real killer, the law that set the stage for everything, was about land. By the early 1700s, 90% of the population was legally forbidden from owning more than 10% of their own country. Think about that.
This system created two completely different worlds on one tiny island. On one side, you have the wealthy Protestant landlord, probably living a comfortable life over in England, who owned these massive estates that were, by the way, confiscated from the ancestors of the very people now working them. And on the other side, you have people like the Murphys, the tenant at will. That meant no lease, no security. You could be kicked out at any moment for any reason. And get this, the cruelest part, if you made any improvements to your little hut, maybe you built a wall or fixed the roof, that improvement immediately became the landlord's property. There was just no way to get ahead.
So this system created this inevitable cascade straight to a crisis. Here's how it worked. First, you had to pay the crushing rent. To do that, you had to use your best plot of land to grow cash crops, like wheat or oats, which were then shipped off to England. That left you with only the smallest, rockiest, worst patch of ground to grow food for your own family. And on that kind of terrible soil, only one crop could produce enough calories to keep a family alive for a year: the potato.
And they relied on one specific variety called the lumper. It was apparently pretty watery and tasteless, but it grew like crazy, even in bad soil. But here's the fatal flaw in the whole system. The lumper was grown from cuttings, not from seeds. What that means is that almost every single potato in the whole of Ireland was a genetically identical clone. The country's entire food supply was basically one single teetering pillar.
And in the autumn of 1845, something arrived to knock that pillar over. A strange, dense fog rolled in from the coast, and then came a smell, a foul, unnatural stench of decay that clung to everything. This is the moment the world changes forever. The blight has arrived. I mean, can you even imagine the absolute horror? You're a farmer. You drive your spade into the earth, desperate for the food that you know is the only thing that will keep your children from starving through the winter. And you pull up that. A black, slimy, rotting mush. The potatoes were literally dissolving into this putrid, nauseating slime, sometimes within hours of being dug up. They didn't know it was an airborne fungus that had drifted over from North America. All they knew was that their food, their only food, was gone.
The next year, 1846, brought maybe the cruelest twist of all. The new potato crop looked perfect. It looked healthy. You can just feel the wave of collective relief that must have washed over the entire country. But the damp, mild weather that made the fields look so green was also the perfect breeding ground for the blight. In a single week, it came back with a vengeance and wiped out the entire nation's crop. That brief glimmer of hope, it was a trap that left them completely and utterly defenseless. And as this new, unimaginable dread settled over the land, the calendar turned toward an ancient festival, Samhain. It was the Celtic end of the harvest, a night when they believed the veil between our world and the spirit world was at its thinnest. People would wear costumes and masks to hide themselves from any wandering ghosts. They carved these grotesque faces into turnips, the original jack-o'-lanterns, to scare off evil. They were preparing for a night of folklore ghosts with no idea that a million new, very real ghosts were about to be made.
And that brings us to the year that would be burned into the Irish memory forever, Black 47. This is the point where a natural disaster transforms into a man-made atrocity. Because here is the single most baffling, most infuriating fact of the entire famine. While millions of people were starving to death, food was being shipped out of Ireland for profit. In 1847, the absolute worst year of the hunger, nearly 4,000 ships loaded with food sailed from Irish ports to England. 4,000. And this chart just brilliantly illustrates what was on those ships. Eyewitnesses wrote about seeing carts overflowing with grain, guarded by British soldiers rolling right past the skeletal figures of people who were literally dying for want of that exact food. So let's be clear, this was not a famine of no food. It was a famine of access. How could this possibly happen? Well, to understand that, you have to look at the man in charge of the British government's relief effort, a guy named Sir Charles Trevelyan. And this quote reveals his absolutely chilling worldview. He genuinely believed the famine was a punishment from God, a direct stroke of providence, sent to cure the social evil of the Irish people. He didn't see a population to be saved, he saw a moral failing to be corrected by starvation. So the relief he created offered only these horrific choices. You could enter a workhouse, but that meant giving up your land forever. Your family would be separated, men from women, children from parents, and you had a 1 in 4 chance of dying from diseases like typhus or cholera inside. Or you could get soup from Protestant missionaries, but only if you publicly renounced your Catholic faith. It was a choice between physical starvation and what they saw as spiritual damnation. The relief was designed to break the spirit long before it ever filled the stomach. As the years dragged on, landlords started mass evictions. They hired gangs called crowbar brigades to physically tear down people's homes so they could never come back. Thrown out onto the roads with nowhere to go, the only hope left for anyone who could scrape together a few pounds was to escape the island entirely. But that journey was a whole other kind of horror. They were crammed onto these old, rickety vessels that quickly earned a new name: coffin ships. Imagine it: dark, airless cargo holds, packed with hundreds of sick, starving, desperate people. With no sanitation and barely any food or water, diseases spread like wildfire. For way too many, these weren't voyages to a new life, they were floating graves. And the numbers are just staggering. In that one year, 1847, over 17,000 people died just trying to cross the Atlantic. That's thousands and thousands of souls who were lost at sea, their bodies just wrapped in rags and dropped overboard into the cold ocean. The survivors who finally stumbled ashore in places like Boston, New York, and Montreal, they brought almost nothing with them. No money, no possessions. The only things they had were their memories and their traditions. And this, right here, is the moment modern Halloween is born, directly from that unimaginable trauma. You can see the direct lineage right here. The old Irish tradition of carving turnips was adapted to what was available in the New World: the larger Native American pumpkin, which was way easier to carve. And the custom of guising, where people would go door to door reciting verses for food for the Samhain feast, well, now that carried the painful fresh memory of desperate begging for survival. Over decades, surrounded by American abundance, that slowly softened into the playful ritual we now call trick-or-treating. So, if you remember one thing, let it be this: modern Halloween is like cultural scar tissue. It's the way a deeply traumatized people found to process, to contain, and to ultimately mask an unspeakable horror. They turned their real, personal ghosts into costumes their children could wear, and their nightmares into a night of fun. And the final toll of the Great Hunger is almost beyond comprehension. At least 1 million people died. Another 2 million fled as refugees. In just a handful of years, the population of Ireland was slashed by nearly a third. It was a demographic catastrophe that the island is, in many ways, still recovering from today. So the next time you see a jack-o'-lantern glowing on a porch, maybe you'll see it a little differently. not just as a pumpkin, but as the ghost of a hollowed-out turnip, its little candle lit to ward off spirits by a family that had survived an absolute nightmare. And it kind of leaves us with this final powerful question to think about. What ghosts from our own history are we still carrying with us, hidden deep inside our brightest and happiest celebrations?
And so, another chapter closes. For more journeys into history's forgotten files, please like and subscribe. Your next story awaits.